Everyone here has shown great fortitude in dealing with the fact that our waiters did not show up, but I trust that everyone is well nourished from our sushi. And I'm eagerly looking forward to what should be a healthy but not contentious exchange between Paul Saunders. I assume that Paul is familiar to many of you. He was our esteemed colleague, not for years, but actually for decades at the Center for the National Interest, which was formerly known as the Nixon Center. And he has recently departed the institution, but he is not gone. He continues to contribute to our magazine and website, and has also, I believe, joined the board of the center. And to my left is David Hart, who is an expert on energy and innovation, and is both a professor at George Mason University, previously served in the Obama administration, and is now a senior fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I will let Paul begin and then have a comment from David.
Thanks very much, Jacob. It's of course a real pleasure for me to be back here at the Center for the National Interest, where I've spent so much time. It's a particular pleasure to be at the Center for the National Interest during what now I think almost everyone is calling an era of great power competition. Because I remember 20 years ago when Dimitri and I and others would warn about the idea of great power competition. There were a lot of people who didn't take that very seriously. And I particularly remember one of our former national security advisors who was very derisive in comments about that 19th century thinking, which seems to have come back in a lot of different places. But, you know, I start with that actually because that's really, from my perspective, kind of the foundation really of what I want to talk about. You know, we're in an era of growing competition among great powers. I would say particularly between the United States and China. There are many people here who know a lot more about China than I do or ever will. So I won't try to say too much about that relationship other than to say that I think it's clear that we're in a competitive relationship. It may not have been necessary for it to become quite as competitive as it is, quite as quickly as it did. But at this point, that's, from my perspective, water under the bridge. We have the relationship that we have, and I don't see clear evidence that having a different particular person at the kind of number one leadership position in either country would make a profound difference in the dynamics that have been set in place. If I would be maybe a little bit too glib about it, I would say, you know, to me, it looks sort of like a situation in which, you know, you have kind of a contentious marriage and then one party decides to hire a divorce lawyer. And, you know, it looks to me like we've started down a pathway somewhat like that, in which both sides start thinking about their own interests in a much more kind of narrow and focused way, and they think about protecting their interests in a much more narrow and focused way. But again, there are people here who know a lot more about the U.S.-China relationship that's just where I'm coming from intellectually. As I think about that kind of competition, as an American, naturally, I want the United States to prevail. There are many people who write for the National Interest magazine who focus on, we should have this number of ships or that kind of new airplane or this particular military tactic or strategy. I think I'm trying to take a little bit of a step back from that and to say, well, we need to have an economy that can sustain the military that we think we need, and we'll have a national debate, I imagine over a long period of time, about what kind of military that is and what it should do. But we need to have an economy that can sustain that, and that can be competitive well into the future. For me, the next step is to look at our energy systems in the American economy. And when people say energy, they're often kind of talking about just oil and gas. I have in mind something much broader here. I'm talking about electricity, certainly oil and gas, but also power generation, nuclear power, renewables, other things that perhaps no one has thought of yet. I find energy intellectually an important place to start in thinking about our economic competitiveness and kind of sustained economic growth, because it touches on every other part of our economy and society. Anything that there is that you want to do, energy is an input. There are some areas where it's a bigger input, like metallurgy or something like that. There are other areas where it's a smaller input. But having more energy at kind of more affordable prices, and obviously having it be safe and secure, reliable, everything else, it benefits the entire economy. So that's where I'm coming from. That's why I wrote this piece. I won't try to repeat the whole piece. I think the main thrust of the argument is that I think that we need a much more systematic and focused effort through federal policy to try to push forward energy innovation in the United States. And I think the benefits aren't strictly economic. I mean, certainly there are foreign policy benefits as well. If we look backward at fracking, and again, I don't want to focus narrowly on that set of issues, but if we look backward at fracking, I think the economic and foreign policy benefits of those technical developments are pretty amazing. There was an article that I saw, I think about a week or so ago, on the CNBC website, actually quoting a number of people who were asking, is the link between kind of political instability in the Middle East and oil prices fraying? Is it broken? That's kind of a profound question. The genesis for this argument was that the Iranians had seized this British flag tanker and oil prices didn't go up, and everybody was kind of waiting for oil prices to go up. It didn't happen, something that always would have happened in the past. But anyway, this is just an illustration of one kind of foreign policy benefit that we can see from one kind of energy innovation. In a lot of ways, I see this period that we're in right now as a period that is actually somewhat similar to the late 1950s and early 1960s. And George and I have talked about this before, actually in other contexts. But it's a time very much like that time when everyone is sort of feeling out the rules and parameters of a new order that is, in that case, I think, was established, kind of into the mid-50s, and then perhaps sharpened in definition after that. In this case, I think probably not quite defined yet, so we have certainly some time to influence how things shake out. But I would particularly point in that context, to steps that the United States took at that time. The missile gap, as it turns out, wasn't quite as much of a gap as people thought at the time. Sputnik, perhaps, on reflection, wasn't actually as threatening as people seemed to think it was at the time. But there was a very substantial reaction to that in American policy. There were massive investments, actually, in innovation and science and technology to try to make sure that the United States would be a leader and could compete effectively with the Soviet Union. And I think we should be thinking in similar terms today. The last thing I'll say, to try to wrap up, and I would certainly welcome David's kind of reaction and ideas, is 3 years ago, if somebody had said to me, well, it's really important for the Congress to appropriate billions of additional dollars to the Energy Department or somewhere else to promote research and development of new energy technologies. My response to that would have been, you're crazy. The Republican Party will never agree to anything like that. Today, I think we're actually living in a different world than that for a variety of reasons. One is actually that I think this competition with China is increasingly shaping how members of Congress think, including how they think about the budget. But secondly, I think that Republican Party doesn't really exist anymore. And the Republican Party that we have now, 3 years later, is a different Republican Party. I know that David, I think will mention Marco Rubio, and actually shared something with me that his committee had produced that was quite interesting. So I will be very brief, but I just want to make one point. When Marco Rubio is advocating an industrial policy for the United States of America, that something in the Republican Party has changed. And I think that the party that we have today is much more likely to be supportive of the kind of effort that I'm describing than I think support for that kind of approach is fairly clear. So let me end there and turn it over to
Thanks, Paul.
David.
Great. Well, thanks, Paul, for the invitation into the center. It's nice to be. Let me just amend my introduction to Jacob gave me, which is to mention the Schar School of Policy and Government. My dean has been on my case that I make clear that is my main affiliation. It's not the Mercatus Center, it's not the law school, not the economics department, nor is my main affiliation with ITIF, although I'm spending a lot of time there. So it's Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason. At ITIF, I run a program on clean energy innovation policy, focuses primarily on federal policy. I left a couple of handouts out in front. One is a recent report. It's an excerpt from a recent report by a couple of our senior fellows on the role of DoD in civilian clean energy innovation, and I wasn't going to talk about that in my remarks, but I'm happy to discuss it. But it may be of interest to folks in the room, and we have lots of other stuff on the website. And then I also reproduced an op-ed, which I will reference in my remarks. So let me commend Paul for raising an interesting and important topic. Obviously, I'm biased on this since it's my specialty, and also for framing it in an interesting way. So my specialty is U.S. science and technology policy, and for the last 10 or 15 years, specializing in energy, but also with the sideline in manufacturing, regional economic development, and those kinds of issues. And that was what I wound up working on for the previous administration and a year off from teaching. But what drives my interest in energy is climate change, and I think that could have been featured more prominently in Paul's article, and it ought to in our discussion. Now, I would admit that some of the recent rhetoric has been overwrought. I don't think climate change is an existential threat to the same extent as the nuclear arms race was. But while it might not wipe out human civilization, it is going to make our civilization different. 100 years from now, we were just referring to this. There was a recent piece that tried to look at how cities' climates might be different, and it featured the idea that Toronto would be like Washington, D.C. So that's a different world, and it's not for the better, generally speaking, at least that's what the model suggests. So while we can't stop a lot of these changes, we can and should try to limit the damage. And that's where innovation comes in, and that's why I'm interested in it. And one of the great ironies, and Paul didn't quite allude to this, but we ought to put it on the table, is that the previous great vulnerability of the United States, right, which was its dependence on Middle Eastern oil, has been, to a great extent, ameliorated because of innovation. And this was a public-private endeavor to create fracking, and we can talk about that if you're interested in. But that isn't our biggest challenge going forward. We have a new challenge, and that's climate. So how does China figure into this? So I think Paul's view is we're doomed to competition, and I would say we're doomed to co-opetition. We share a planet, and every molecule of carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere, whether it's our molecule or China's molecule, affects both of us. So there has to be some kind of cooperation around that. But when it comes to solutions, and we're going to need solutions of many, many different kinds, there's going to be competition, and it's not always going to be on our term. And we know that China has a pattern of subsidizing its companies and its competitors, and even supporting cyber theft and other kinds of illicit behavior to give them an advantage. And this is one of ITIF's specialties and one of my interests. And they've labeled this innovation mercantilism, so pursuing advantage in the global market with the impact of slowing down innovation in the rest of the world. So Paul says Washington cannot afford unilateral disarmament. I agree with that, but neither can we afford a purely conflictual frame. So I really have a problem with the notion of energy dominance, which I view in that mode. So my op-ed is called Declare Cold War on Global Warming. It's not Declare Cold War on China. And it makes 3 big points. The first is that we're going to need a very durable policy. That means it has to be bipartisan given our system. This is a policy that needs to last for several decades at least. Second, innovation is at the core, and in that way, I think the analogy to the Cold War, and Paul talked about this, is very strong. That was what won the Cold War for the U.S., and we need to build on that success. And then the third point is that we need to lead the world. There is going to have to be some kind of global cooperation. I'm a supporter of the Paris Agreement. I think setting goals and targets is important, but we also have to create knowledge. We have to create solutions across a lot of different energy sectors, and that's a positive-sum game. Everybody in the world should be participating, and if we have exchange, that's going to make the whole thing move faster. So there was another agreement that's not as well known that was signed at the same time as the Paris Accord called Mission Innovation, which was an effort to try to mobilize all the leading R&D countries to spend more. So that's the cooperation side of the ledger, but let me then turn to the competition side, which may be of more interest. It's definitely the case that some of this knowledge is going to be turned into profit opportunities. We need to motivate the private sector to develop and sell these solutions. That's the only way we're going to scale the response to climate change quickly enough, and competition is obviously a big and positive part of that process. It does feed innovation. But if China doesn't play by the same rules, and they don't, there are going to be conflicts and challenges around this competition. So an example in the past is solar panels. Massive subsidies by the Chinese destroyed the entire solar panel manufacturing capacity of the rest of the world, not just the US, but everywhere. There were trade cases brought, but they were basically ineffective. Now, this has been a mixed blessing, and I hope we'll have an event in the fall at ITIF on this topic. These subsidies definitely accelerated cost reduction in solar panels. And it accelerated deployment as a result, and in some sense was a perverse subsidy of poorer country to the rest of the world, right? The Chinese subsidize our adoption of solar panels, but it also, I think, had the effect of slowing down innovation. In the US, there are new materials, new kinds of products that could have been offered, but that were just undercut by the massive subsidies to the existing technologies. So this is the hypothesis of innovation mercantilism, and again, I'm starting a project where we're going to try to substantiate that view. Second example, now looking forward, is electric vehicles and batteries. And it certainly looks like the Chinese have the same game plan in that industry, massive subsidies, potentially overcapacity, and a risk of what we refer to as technological lock-in. So I have another paper on this, which I'm happy to refer people to, where if you massively subsidize an existing technology in a low-cost country, then you can really deter the next phase of technology in the higher cost country where we are. But electric vehicles is a different game than solar panels in that the auto sector is a huge sector. I don't think the US is going to let its auto sector go. Certainly Europe isn't going to let its auto sector go. So this is going to play out a bit differently. And we know that the EU is already starting to take action. They've started a series of policies that the shorthand that may be useful is Airbus for batteries. And we also see a new development as well, which is a Chinese multinational establishing a plant in Europe to supply VW and BMW. So this is, I think, an important development. Previously, the main suppliers of batteries have been Japanese and Korean companies. So there's a whole competition in Asia around the battery market and EV market. So that's another part of our new project on this. For the US, Tesla is basically, for the moment, our national champion. And that reflects our national strengths in a way, right? Entrepreneurship, thinking big, billionaires with the willingness to spend on their projects. But obviously, Tesla has many weaknesses, as anybody who watches CNBC will know. The federal government, quite frankly, really hasn't been a big player. The states have really been the drivers, especially California with its mandate for electric cars. There is a federal tax credit, but it has some problems. The federal government is now rolling back fuel economy standards, which would have accelerated adoption of electric vehicles. Now, federal R&D has led to some great new technologies, for instance, next generation batteries, but it's really unclear whether these technologies will be scaled up in the United States. And one of the things that we've seen in recent years is foreign investors coming in and buying these companies and then basically taking the technology home and scaling them at home. And I think this figured into some of the discussions around strengthening CFIUS and so on, acquisitions. Don't know that that's been applied in the energy sector, but it easily could be. So what should we be doing? So I certainly think Paul is right that innovation should be at the core of our strategy, and we need to spend more on R&D, and we have plenty of material on the ITIF website about that. But I also think we need a pull policy. So to accelerate innovation, we need a push from the technology side, but also a pull from the market. And that's going to have to come through a carbon tax, clean energy standard, or some other form of regulation. This is not a problem that the market is going to solve on its own. It's an externality. It's a global externality, which what makes it so challenging. So the government has to create a market structure in which firms can compete in events. And I think this is both at the economy-wide level, but also at the sector level, in the power sector, the transportation sector, and so on. And with respect to China, I think we have to work to create a balance between areas where we have shared interests, basic research, sharing knowledge, cooperating on demonstration projects. And as a professor, I think every professor in the room probably realizes the tremendous value that Chinese students have brought to our universities, the brain power, the relationships. It's amazing, and that's at risk right now. So that's on the one side. On the other hand, we do have to find a way to get to fair competition in product development, and delivering services. And we need allies to do this. We're going to need to work with Europe and Japan and other like-minded countries. So I think we need something that's more muscular than what we saw under Obama, but if I can say, a little more subtle than what we're seeing under Trump. And I do share Paul's concern about dividing the world into two technology blocks, but I do think that could occur in some industries. And then, as Paul mentioned, I just closed with this new development, which is Marco Rubio's advancing industrial policy. Now, this is not just in the energy area, but across a range of industries. And I would recommend people take a look at Small Business Committee's couple of recent reports on this topic. Maybe this is potentially the Republican successor of, to Trump, taking some of his actions. I kind of hesitate to call them ideas, but actions and strategies, and putting them into a more coherent framework. So I'm curious to see what people's thoughts are on that. And thanks again for the chance to join you today.
Maybe briefly. I'll try to respond kind of very quickly just to several things. I certainly don't want an extended U.S. competition with China. I kind of hope that we will maintain cooperative elements in our relationship. As a practical matter, I think that will be very challenging. And I guess I would say like probably most people in the establishment, have been supportive of this kind of concept of cooperate when we can and confront when we have to, which is sort of the framing that people come up with for relationships like that. The theory behind that is that you get kind of most of the benefits of cooperation, and you can also enjoy most of the benefits of being able to confront. The challenge in practice, I think, at least as I have watched this relationship, is that the confrontational side kind of prevents you from developing really the cooperation that you need, and the cooperation that you want kind of puts brakes on your ability to confront when you think you might need to. So instead of getting the best of both worlds, I would ask sort of rhetorically, do you end up with the worst of both worlds? I'm not saying that because I have a better recommendation, because actually I don't. I think it's a really difficult problem. I'm just pointing out in practice, I think there is a real intellectual challenge in taking this approach where we're kind of trying to have two different policies at the same time. That's really what I'm trying to say. Climate change, I believe is a serious problem. I think it's something that I'd like to see a federal policy to address. I think in pursuing energy innovation, we can try to address that. I think, again, as a practical matter, in building bipartisan consensus, I think it's much better to make energy policy that has beneficial climate effects than it is to try to make climate policy that has damaging energy and economic consequences. And it'll be the kind of the high watermark of international climate diplomacy, because of how I look at the evolving international system from this point forward. And some people would perhaps view that as very troubling. I'm maybe a little bit more sanguine about that, because actually what I think we really need is the kinds of technologies that I'm talking about here, new energy technologies that reduce emissions. What we need out of diplomacy is, from my perspective, not so much targets and timetables, but much more systems that will reduce the friction in the system in getting these technologies deployed around the world. So that's much more about kind of trade and investment policy and intellectual property protection and that kind of thing, rather than kind of this quantity of greenhouse gas emissions by this time. But I'll leave it there.
Well, we already have someone who's eagerly signaled that he wants to ask a question, none other than Michael Vlahos.
Well, in the global compass of energy and climate change, the real geopolitical divide, I would suggest, is not between the US and China, but rather within the American belief system itself. In other words, the larger divide, the existential divide within American society, is the thing that will, that has the potential, one could argue, to most overturn having any kind of coherent policy. And if you watch the debate, as it was called last night, this morning, consonant with the conversation, there appeared an article in The Nation that basically declared that America should, in order to have a green path ahead, should embark upon an authoritarian approach to dealing with climate change. There was no alternative, and that suited the populist tides of the day. So there you have an anchor on one side calling for an approach that has, Stalinist overtones, and then on the other side you have the reservoir of the romantic period of the, oil wildcatters, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't see any a meeting here. This is truly an existential divide. And I was wondering, although you two deployed, the most gentle and diplomatic language concerning this divide, how would you see any kind of compromise that would result in America being able to participate in a constructive way ahead in terms of both energy and climate change?
Do you want to go first, David, or
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you're
It seems
asking
like
is how do we
it's
find a durable policy in the United States to reduce our emissions? And I am worried about the dynamics that you describe. I think there is an action-reaction process going on that's, I mean, it's not confined to climate, but climate may be the area where it's most exaggerated, where, the two parties are pushing each other apart. So it's worrisome. I guess, I would see some signs of hope.
When you say apart, what do you mean?
So I mean, on the one hand, you have the vision of the Green New Deal, which I wouldn't go quite as far as you would go in terms of characterizing it, but it calls for a 10-year mobilization on the scale of World War II, which was 35% of GDP. I mean, I don't think they're thinking in those numbers, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, well, we need at least $10 trillion. Now, I don't know where these numbers come from, but nonetheless, there's a strong position there. It's not really worked out in policy terms, and I think it's certainly possible that, if Elizabeth Warren gets elected, the people implementing climate policy wind up looking a lot like the ones under the Obama administration, because that's kind of the way these things work. But nonetheless, there will be pressure from the left for more draconian solutions. There's also a current on the left that is bottom up. The fact that the states have been driving the policy, states and cities have been driving the policy. There's a lot of interest in sort of community energy, options. So in California, they have these solar cooperatives essentially, and a lot of interest in municipalizing utilities. So I think there are different threads on the left. But to me, the more worrisome thing is declaring it to be a crisis and saying, we need to solve it in 10 years, which I think is nuts. And there was a nice piece by the Breakthrough Institute in which they compared it to diabetes. Like, this is a chronic condition we have. We're gonna have to live with it, not just our lives, but basically for all the generations that we can think of. I mean, this stuff stays in the air for 1,000 years, roughly. Maybe we can pull it out, maybe we can't. So to me, this sort of, rush to action, despite the gravity of the situation, nonetheless is worrisome. And then on the other side, complete denial of the science. I mean, that's another extreme position. But so I was going to go to the positive here, which is, and Paul references, at least in this Congress, some signs of a bipartisan notion of, we need to start investing in technologies as I said, I don't think that's enough, but it would sure be a good start. So starting to push some of these other solutions forward. There are definitely Republicans who are in the middle. The senator from Alaska, who I got to meet last week, if you were watching the news, Anchorage was in the 90s most of the month of July, and that's, I don't know that Anchorage is going to become like Washington, but if Toronto is, that means Anchorage is going to be, like Vancouver or something. So the real effects are being felt, and maybe it's kind of sad, but that's an ameliorating factor.
Let me respond to that too. I mean, I think there is a pathway to a bipartisan agreement, and in full disclosure, that's what the organization I'm with is trying to do. Maybe I'm a little bit self-serving in holding that view, but I think there is a pathway. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, on this question of the denial of the science that David raised, I have a somewhat different view. I think if you certainly read and listen to what many Republican elected officials have said over the years, it looks like they've been denying the science. I think in reality, what has been happening actually is that they haven't thought very much about this issue. They haven't in the past cared very much about this issue. They have relatively few, if any, policy ideas of their own. If they enter into a debate about what is the best policy solution in dealing with that issue, at least up until now, it's a debate they would lose because they actually don't have a response. And I think in that political context, it's a far more attractive position to take politically to kind of deny the lessons of what happened with healthcare reform, actually, is that if you don't have your own alternative, then you lose. There's another lesson from that, which is if you don't proceed in a bipartisan manner, then your victory is unlikely to be a sustainable one. And that's kind of, to me, another reason that we should really want to have a bipartisan approach. But if you look at what Republicans are saying now, certainly since the midterm election, I think the rhetoric is shifting demonstrably. You don't see the same kinds of comments really so much about the science. I suspect, but have little data to support, that actually members of Congress are going home to their states and districts, and they're actually hearing from their constituents about real-world impacts that people are feeling. I think it's under those circumstances harder for them to take the position that I just described, but they still don't have much to offer. I think the pathway forward obviously requires kind of both sides being flexible. I think it requires, as I alluded to earlier, making energy policy and not making climate policy, not trying to kind of, from my perspective, make energy policy through the back door, but just to make an energy policy that makes sense as an energy policy and also helps with climate. And I guess finally, I would say if Democrats insist on a public apology, then forget it, because we will never get there. We will never get there.
Our next question is from Ambassador Birch. Microphone's coming.
Thanks, Jacob. I really have two questions, and either one of you can really address them. The first is, this administration has proclaimed a policy or a strategy of energy dominance. What, in your view, does that mean? Is that just a bumper sticker, or is there any content to this policy or strategy? And secondly, in thinking about the debate about climate change and obviously energy in the United States, I'm always struck by the fact, and maybe it's because I spend too much time in Europe, by the fact that there is such a disparity between how Europeans think about this issue and the Americans. And the reason I drag in the Europeans is they're roughly at the same level of development as we are. They're not the Indonesians or the Indians or the Chinese, and they don't have the benefit of being able to say, gee, we're not an advanced industrial society, therefore you got to cut us some slack on the environment. But if you look at the Europeans, and especially the Germans, climate change has become a national obsession. You just look at the impact this 12-year-old Swedish school student has had in Europe in lecturing, adults all over the continent. How do you account for that sort of, really, I would say it's the one area, the greatest fundamental difference between America and Europe. How do you account for this difference?
I
You wanna take energy dominance?
I can,
You did speak
I
that
can,
one,
I
yeah.
can respond a little bit on both, and I'd be
Okay.
very interested to hear your views. Yeah, energy dominance, I address it a little bit in the piece, and if you read the national security strategy, they sort of try to articulate a little bit what it means. My impression is that it's kind of a little bit a slogan in search of a definition, to be very candid. In the piece, I tried to take sort of a constructive approach to that idea as something to build on rather than something to throw aside, because we have the administration that we have, and if you're trying to be a voice in policy debates, I wanted to try to make it relevant to the administration that we have. But to my mind, there's perhaps a little bit too little focus on the kinds of things that I was talking about, and a little bit too much focus on we're gonna sell our gas to this particular country, and then there will be much more free than they are today, which I'm all in favor of American natural gas exports, but I wouldn't perhaps focus excessively on that. With the Europeans, I have two hypotheses, which are not mutually exclusive, but no data. One is just, if you look historically at Europe and the United States and our societies, they are somewhat more socially oriented societies. And if you look at things like individualism versus collectivism and public attitudes, there's a spectrum, and the Europeans are a little bit more to the left of us or the right of us, or depending on how you orient the spectrum on that issue. I think there's a more sort of social attitude that's cultivated in people as they're younger. But I think there's also actually a second thing, and I may be wrong, this is strictly a hypothesis, but my impression is that the European right of center parties did not take the position actually of disputing the science, which did happen in the United States. And consequently, in Europe, there was a kind of a public discussion much earlier about problems like refugees, mass migration as consequences of climate change. And my hypothesis would be actually that for some people on the European right, that actually may have been a reason to support trying to do something about climate change, to try to prevent those kinds of impacts. And I'm talking about before Syria here, not since. I'm talking about before Syria.
I think I can't resist.
But Jacob,
I have to interject one thing here.
Here's the Europe expert.
I'm not. I think there is another explanation, which is go to a church in Europe on a Sunday and it will be empty. And let's face it, climate change is real, but it is also, when you see a 12-year-old in Sweden behaving like a young Joan of Arc, there's a theological component here. They're worshiping at a new shrine.
So I think I'll flip Paul's explanation on its head and say the explanation is the Republican Party of the United States. The Republican Party is almost unique in the world in its position on this. Look at the CDU, even the Tories, for goodness sake. You know, they are trying to come up with alternative solutions. So I think, to me, that's a much more compelling answer, that the United States is what stands out, not Europe. I do think there is a difference in having green parties. I do think that makes a difference. And, you know, I don't know that I could trace the whole story of that, but I think certainly in Germany, that's part of it as well. On energy dominance, I guess my perspective, I do think it's mostly a slogan, but there's kind of a narrow, to the extent that it has policy impact, there's kind of a narrow version, which is, you know, exporting LNG to try to get Europe off the Russian gas. And then a somewhat broader version, which was alluded to, which is that the oil price, you know, it's now much less of a factor than it was because the U.S. can ramp up production and kind of counteract OPEC. Now, that's not quite dominance, but to me, it's to the extent that I can put a policy, content in it. That's what it is. Certainly, we don't see, you know, let's take nuclear. We don't see the U.S. taking the kinds of actions in nuclear policy that you would think would correspond with energy dominance. So, you know, it could potentially be developed by a future Rubio administration, who knows? But I don't see this administration sort of working out all the implications and then taking action.
George had a question. George Beebe, who is Paul's successor at the center.
Oh, big shoes.
Always dangerous to get a question from the successor.
So when we talk about energy innovation and its implications for great power competition, one aspect of that is ideas, technology, the innovation itself. But another aspect of that is access to the materials that one needs to fuel those technologies, and that is changing. It's becoming less and less petroleum based energy production and more exotic materials. And what I have in mind in particular is access to rare earth metals, which seems to be increasingly a part of some of the more advanced technologies that we're talking about. What are the implications of China's dominance of access to the world's supply of many of these rare earth materials? And does this affect prospects for, on the one hand, competition, on the other hand, cooperation? Can we cooperate in a market in which China has 90% of what we need for the technologies that we're trying to develop and use?
David?
Yeah, so this is something I don't know all that much about, I must admit. I do think it's an entry point for the Republican Party as well into this, and we've seen this with Senate Energy Committee. It expressed an interest in strategic materials, does connect back to some of those Cold War themes. There was a period in around 2010, 2011 where there was an effort to embargo rare earths to Japan, and it was alluded to a little bit in the trade talks recently. So it's at least floated out there. I would guess that it's worth our while to try to think about whether there are alternatives, whether it's developing our own resources or alternative materials. The one I know more about are some of the heavy metals that are used in electric vehicles. And there is an element of US-China competition on a global basis around these, particularly in Africa, but not just in Africa. And I would say that Chinese have been, you know, much more strategic in their thinking and building relationships around access to these materials. And, you know, if we actually had a policy, then we might start to think like, well, where does this supply come from? But at this point, we haven't even formulated a serious policy, so very hard for us to think down that chain. But the one that's of most concern is cobalt, and that comes mostly out of the Congo. And that's a challenge for any, I mean, if that's where your supply comes from, that's a challenge. But it's a somewhat different set of concerns than, let's say, petroleum, just because these materials are used in relatively small quantities. They're often not mined for their own sake, but they're byproducts of other mining. So there are some real complications. But I think the short answer is we really haven't yet put our minds to it in the United States. And it is something of an opportunity, I think, for for more conservative foreign policy thinkers to push the U.S. in this direction.
I'll add something very brief on that because I also know very little about it, but it's my impression that part of the reason that China is in the market position that it's in is, it's price, right? And they've kind of made other producers or put them into a position where their production is not economical. And when you're thinking in terms of making money on a mine, then the economics matters. When you're thinking about protecting your national security, then economics, as we often find in our history, becomes a secondary consideration. So I understand that there, have been historically mines in the United States producing these materials. They're not currently, because it isn't economical, which metals and how much, and, I would certainly leave that to others. But like many things in life, how much are you willing to spend? So.
Dimitri?
One comment and one question. Paul, you're absolutely right about the importance of bipartisanship. And this center was based kind of on the hope that bipartisanship was possible and assumption it was essential. I think that we're in a new era, or at least we may be entering a new era, when bipartisanship would be increasingly difficult. Because I was concerned when candidate Trump was calling his rivals during the election season little marker, low energy, and etc. But let's face it, these were insults which reflected Trump's unique manner. This is not something that could be politically damaging. When people start talking about Moscow Mitch McConnell, when they make unsubstantiated allegations about somebody being racist, for those who consider these allegations untrue, that creates a kind of an environment when bipartisanship may be very difficult indeed. And how long this kind of animosity lasts, and to what extent you can overcome it, like you were talking, or overcoming rivalry in the US-Chinese relationship, I don't know. But we're clearly in different environments. But you mentioned Senator Rubio. And Senator Rubio now, of course, wants to have a new bill, which will introduce new, more comprehensive sanctions against Russia. And they're discussing, as you probably already know in Moscow, how they would respond to Senator Rubio. And one response was suggested by Senator Alexei Pushkov, who suggested that Russia should pass something that he calls Hostile Nation Reciprocity Act. And nations which engage in hostile behavior against Russia should be subjected to the following treatment according to this bill, which was not even introduced. Right. But Pushkov is very well connected in Moscow, as you know, and I don't think he would be talking about something like that without how to put it some clearance. So first, Russia would not vote at the UN Security Council for any sanctions introduced by hostile nations. And I don't need to explain the implications. Second, hostile nations will not be allowed to have any presence in Russia, except special, carefully defined areas, like, for instance, investments in areas which they consider in their national interest. All Russian organizations involved in politics would have to testify under oath that they do not receive any assistance, any funding or any guidance from anybody connected with hostile nations. For instance, hostile nation in this case, it would not be just that it would be coming from a hostile nation government, but if it is coming, let's say, from a resident of a hostile country, anything coming financially from Mikhail Berezovsky, who is a resident of London. So you can imagine what it would do to the Russian opposition movement. And Pushkov suggested that now if you don't register as a foreign agent when you're supposed to, it's an administrative violation, and your organization can be shut down. He wants to make it a criminal offense equal to treason. Last but not least, and that's the reason I'm asking this question, he suggested that the president of Russia should get the right to provide military assistance and to enter into short-term military agreements with nations which are under assault from hostile powers. And as a specific example, Mr. Pushkov mentioned Iran. And as you probably know, there will be already in September naval maneuvers, joint naval maneuvers, Russian and Iranian in the Strait of Hormuz. Today we have learned that a Chinese destroyer will be joining the maneuvers. So the question is, in the new technological environment with our energy dominance, do we assume that all geopolitics is dead, or is it dead only up to a point, and if there would be real trouble in the Straits, there may be consequences, energy consequences?
Sure. Well, I certainly would never take the view that geopolitics is dead. I'm quite concerned by the direction of the U.S.-Russia relationship. I'm very concerned by the direction of the U.S.-China relationship. And, the United States is not producing enough oil and gas to support the global economy, if the Persian Gulf is shut off or something like that. Certainly not. I'll sort of pivot and go a little bit in a different direction, but I think it's also connected because of some of the issues that you were raising. I brought up briefly in the article Huawei, and David mentioned also briefly the concern that I expressed that we could see the evolution of what I call technology blocks, in the world, because we will press our allies, not to buy technologies from particular countries. Some countries like Russia may reciprocate, others like China, actually, I think probably might not reciprocate. They would want to sort of keep buying American technology, even if we perhaps limit some of theirs, who knows. But moving forward, I'm certainly worried that we're going to see more and more of that kind of behavior.
Paul, I'm just showing you something.
Oh, sure. I think that oh, yes. Okay. This is about Russia and Huawei, where there has been actually a closer and closer connection, which speaks a little bit to this whole issue. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently actually is what we should be thinking about in U.S. foreign policy if we start to see, if we are kind of determined ourselves to limit our own purchases and use of Chinese technologies, and to encourage others to do the same. What are some of the implications of that, and what are some of the things that we can do about it? And to me, it seems like in that environment, to the extent that we really want our allies to go along with our preferences, which many of them are likely to be quite reluctant to do, I think we need, among other things, to be thinking of ways to make it much more attractive to our allies to do that. And one approach that I have been thinking about is adding kind of a much stronger technology component to many of our alliance relationships. This is already fairly well developed, actually, institutionally with Japan, but it's not, there's a lot of structure, but there's not a lot of oomph there. In some other relationships, like Korea, the institutional structure it isn't there either. But it seems to me that we would be much more effective actually in talking to our allies about their use of Chinese technology if we went to them and said, look, we'd really like to have a comprehensive technology partnership with you, in energy, maybe also in other things. And these are some of the kinds of things that we'd like to do together, and this is how we think it would benefit both of us in our relationship. But, of course, if we were to do this, there might also have to be some restrictions on who else you would be kind of working with, rather than just coming and saying, boy, you better not buy any of that Huawei stuff, or we'll get really mad. This is an approach that I've been increasingly thinking about. It seems to me to be something that is likely to get more and more important, because I think we're going to see sort of more and more of this Russia-China technology cooperation. I think we're going to be kind of cutting ourselves off from both of them and encouraging, again, others to do the same. It's sort of another reminder of some of the things that we went through in the past, actually. I hope we'll have better approaches this time around, but it's certainly something that we experienced before. David, I don't know.
Do you
if
agree? Yeah, I do. I mean, I certainly think we've emphasized our alliances, and it's going to be a crucial piece of diplomacy and foreign policy moving forward.
And actually, I'm sorry, just one last thing. I would say more than that. If we're a nation of 300 million people and we're in a competitive relationship with a nation of 1.3 billion people, and our per capita income is gradually converging, I think our ability to leverage our alliance relationships only becomes more important over time.
Staples and Roy, and then Wayne Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for your terrific comments. Our topic is energy and U.S.-China competition. I wonder if you, Paul and Dave, could give a brief China perspective on this. If we were Chinese sitting in Beijing and looking at the same topic, how would we be addressing it? Here's a country 4.5 times the population of the United States, has to import over a third of its energy.
Right.
It has acute water shortage. It has abundant coal, but has an environment so polluted that for political reasons they have constraints in using coal to generate their power. There are just tons of reasons to think that China, if it continues to grow, is going to have real difficulties meeting its energy needs, and it will always be highly vulnerable because of the lines of communication over which it has to transport a lot of the energy it needs. And what puzzles me is, in responding to this challenge of U.S.-China competition in energy, we seem to be putting more emphasis on defense rather than on offense. Cut off Huawei wherever we can. How are we going to make up for the deficiency of science students in our advanced education when the Asian students start dropping out because of anti-Asian prejudices stirred up by our reaction to all of this? I mean, there's just enormous issues here that somehow we're focusing on the wrong issues and aren't thinking about how we can, final point, we're having electricity brownouts in Washington. We've been talking about global climate warming, and we can't supply the energy we need to keep our air conditioners functioning in the really hot days. Temperature in my bedroom last week at the height of the thing was 85 degrees because they cut off on air conditioning because we can't supply the power. I mean, this is an example of how we're simply not addressing this issue in a serious, planned way, and I'd just be interested in some comments.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess I am firmly in the camp of kind of getting our own house in order being step one in having an effective foreign policy, much less competing with others. So I'm totally with you on that part. I fully recognize all of the challenges that China has, and there are a lot of them, socially, economically, politically, and I certainly think that it's a mistake, whether it's with China or with Russia, or for that matter with the Iranians, to kind of paint people on the other end of a competitive relationship as being sort of 10 feet tall and universally menacing. It's clearly a much more complex situation than that, and they've got enormous problems. At the same time, they are making huge domestic investments in energy technology development. David can correct me, but my impression is they're pursuing some of the advanced nuclear technologies actually a lot more aggressively than we are. After actually coming here and getting a lot of the fundamental research from the Department of Energy. So I think they're kind of well aware of their problems and trying to address them. I'm sure that they at the same time have their own profound sense of vulnerability. You kind of alluded to that, much as we do. I guess while I would much prefer a cooperative relationship with China, and I think there are a lot of areas in which we could cooperate effectively, including this one. I guess I would say a couple of things. One is, it seems to me that the U.S. business community is actually incredibly frustrated trying to work with China. And one of the things that's been most remarkable to me in this whole trade dispute that we're having is you actually hear almost nothing from the business community, where in the past there would have been frequent expressions of concern. And to me, this sort of reflects this frustration, and I kind of go back in my mind to I think 5 or 6 years ago, the National Bureau on Economic Research did that IP theft commission and report, which to me seemed to have sort of a crystallizing effect. I think the sentiment was already there, but I think it kind of crystallized a lot of that frustration. And whatever one's views of how the president is handling this situation, it seems to me like there was something that was wrong in that relationship that needed to be fixed. I'm not sure that I'm going to remember the second thing that I wanted to say. That's okay. I'll pass to David, and maybe it'll come back.
So I think we should remember that the U.S. has a tremendous interest in China addressing its energy and environmental problems, and I think you characterized them well. They have a strong domestic motivation, and we ought to be working towards export opportunities and working with, the Chinese partners. The problem has been the business environment and the approach of the Chinese state to foreign companies. It's changing a little bit. Tesla has been able to have 100% fully owned subsidiary. We'll see, that's the way it's set up now. So in the past, all car companies that went into China had to have a domestic partner, and part of that relationship was about absorbing U.S. or Western technologies. They haven't been all that successful in autos, which is one reason why they're so interested in electric vehicles. But in any case, there is a little bit of motion. We ought to be pushing for that, not just exporting soybeans, right? I mean, this is where our priorities have been a little bit mixed up, in my view. But, on the other side, I do think the Chinese government, and of course, it's not a monolithic country, right? All the provinces and cities are involved as well. At a very high level, the objective has been to follow the Asian development model, which involves exports. And it's just too big a country to follow that model. I mean, it's one thing for the U.S. to be the market of last resort for Hong Kong and Taiwan, and it's another thing for China. So it's going to have to be a different way forward. And again, this is part of where the negotiation has to be, both on their exports to the rest of the world, but also imports. So, but I don't think we should lose sight of their challenges and our interest in helping them solve those challenges.
I'm sorry, I remembered, or do you want to close out?
Oh, I was gonna ask.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna ask Wayne for his final question.
Thank you. Wayne Merrill, the American Foreign Policy Council. I've been looking up at the wall a photograph of Richard Nixon with Jim Schlesinger. And I was privileged to get to know Schlesinger. And of course, he was Secretary of Energy.
He was the first one.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think if he were here, he would be asking, why has there been no mention of market mechanisms, and particularly the price mechanism? Because a lot of government energy policies prove to be wrong. I vividly remember, the number of German administrations who got conned by the notion that the future of the passenger automobile was going to be diesel. Japanese governments put a lot of money into the notion the future of the passenger automobile is going to be hydrogen. Lots of governments have lost tons of money on nuclear energy programs and policies. Even governments that had been successful with them, like France and Japan, are now actually hemorrhaging money on this. I mean, China a few years back committed itself to building a thermal coal power plant every week for years until it discovered the side effects of that. I mean, policies can be wrong. The market can also be wrong. But I can remember a number of times, when energy prices spiked for a variety of geopolitical reasons, and people behaved rationally by consuming less and becoming more efficient in employing technologies. And certainly in my lifetime, the two technologies that have most transformed energy have been LNG and what we broadly call fracking. And both of those were responses, technological and entrepreneurial responses to market mechanisms and price mechanisms. And I just sort of think that you I'm not saying the government doesn't have a role to play in some of these. Certainly, you need more regulation for some of this. I mean, my natal state of Oklahoma is now experiencing all kinds of earthquakes because nobody regulated how they would frack. But I do see, looking up at Jim Schlesinger's photograph there, think that if he were here, he would think that at least price mechanisms and market mechanisms should be part of the discussion, so I raise it.
I agree. I actually think, there has been a lot of interesting work, and much of it has been applied in environmental policy to try to use markets and competition in place of top-down, command and control style regulation. And we see this in climate policy as well. So I think it is invoked a lot. There are certain industries, electric power being the most prominent, where there has to be a government structuring of the industry, and we've seen markets take a much bigger role, at least in 2/3 of the country at the wholesale level. So I think markets are absolutely essential here, and a lot of what policy needs to do is to create markets that can drive these technologies. Now, they have to be able to pick them up at a certain point, and actually fracking did receive a lot of federal R&D support at the beginning, also received tax incentives. So there's a role for government to, what I would call the technology push side. But the demand pull side should be all about creating markets that, you know, have the right basis of competition. And prices have to be a big, you know, a big information tool in that.
I guess maybe the last thing I would say on that point, you know, certainly prices have to be part of the equation, and I think actually, you know, in terms of the organization I work for, actually our sort of key objective really, or one of our key objectives actually is, rather than trying to make dirty energy more expensive, which has thus far been a major focus of policy debate surrounding climate change. We want to make clean energy cheaper, right? And the goal, actually, or one of the goals of significant federal investment in energy innovation, in addition to all of the other things that I described, actually is to make kind of clean, low, zero carbon forms of energy less expensive, and to accelerate the timeline for that happening. Because sure, we can kind of, you know, wait for the market mechanism to work in that area, but I expect that it will develop rather slowly. And I agree with David, actually, that the describing the climate situation as a crisis isn't necessarily a helpful way of thinking about it. It is a much longer term challenge than that. I would add even to what he said that, you know, if you kind of rally people to deal with the crisis and then they do something, then actually they think they're done. And if you give our population and our political leadership the sense that all they have to do is to pass you know, one particular piece of legislation, and then we've kind of addressed that problem and we can move on to our next complex social problem, that's not a good approach. So, you know, yes, prices should be very much at the center of it, but we have to think about what we mean, I guess, when we talk about prices, and we're very focused on this idea of actually trying to make clean energy cheaper.
Well, I hope that everyone enjoyed this energetic conversation, and please join me in thanking Paul and David.
And the highly charged discussion.
Thank you.